On the morning of November 20th, 1980, the crew of Texaco's oil rig on Lake Peigneur, Louisiana, noticed their drill had gotten stuck beneath the surface. 12 men tried to free it, but couldn't do anything about it. And then, a series of loud pops sounded, and the platform started tilting toward the water. Alarmed, the men dashed to the shore. An hour and a half later, they watched as their 150-foot drilling rig worth $5 million mysteriously vanished into a lake with an average depth of just 10 feet. Everything on the lake's surface flowed toward where the drill had been. As the gurgling vortex dragged boats and barges toward ground zero, a fisherman on his boat was heard shouting, "The end of the world is coming!" Can you imagine a lake about 2 square miles drying up completely in just a few hours? But that's exactly what happened. It looked like someone had pulled the plug out of a bathtub. But gravity didn't just swallow up the water. The trees and 50 acres of land followed it into the hole. But the most interesting part happened afterward. But first, coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something under the video, just in case you somehow forgot. Have you ever heard of something called a salt dome? In Louisiana, there are at least 128 of them, and that's just the ones on record. 5 of the domes are along the coast, rising above the surrounding flatlands and wetlands, and they act as landmarks for travelers and locals. Millions of years ago, the land here was covered by salty oceans and inland seas. Then, as the water receded and evaporated, salt was left behind, whole fields of it. The abundance of salt domes in Louisiana and other southern states is a direct result of retreating seawater, particularly the shifts of the Gulf of Mexico over thousands of years. Year after year, these salt fields got buried under rocks and sediments, becoming hidden from view. Salt, being a crystal, is lighter and more buoyant than the heavy rocks above it. Because of this, it will always rise, breaking through the weakest geological layers. Underground, salt acts a bit like a fluid, forming massive domes, and these domes gradually rise higher and higher. As they get closer to the surface, these domes push up the rocks above them, creating hills. That's exactly how the famous 5 islands came to be: Jefferson Island, Avery Island, Weeks Island, Cote Blanche, and Belle Isle in southern Louisiana. Salt domes can stretch between 1 and 5 miles wide and go as deep as 2 miles. So it seems we've figured out what we're dealing with here. And now let's get back to what happened at Lake Peigneur early in the morning on November 20th, 1980. Back then, Lake Peigneur was a small freshwater lake located near Jefferson Island, the northernmost salt dome of Louisiana's 5 salt domes. You know, those 5 islands. The stuck drill, a series of loud pops, and suddenly the hole that formed sucked in water like a giant whirlpool, pulling in mud, trees, barges. Later, what happened would be called the largest man-made whirlpool in history. A tugboat, a dock, another drilling platform, a parking lot, and a big chunk of the nearby Jefferson Island were sucked into the abyss. And it's no wonder that the newspapers called the event the end of the world scene. It's hard for us to show exactly what that whirlpool looked like, because back then people couldn't carry cameras everywhere. So let's just use other footage and you imagine it all on a bigger scale. That water was roaring. I'm not kidding you a bit. The wind was blowing and everything seemed to go dry on the earth and we were sitting on the mud. This is what the fisherman said was going on at the lake.
So that's the last thing I've seen. My boat tied up to the tree, going into the hole.
The suction force was so strong that it changed the direction of the 62-foot channel leading to the Gulf of Mexico and dragged 11 barges from the channel into a swirling whirlpool. They were pulled in for good, disappearing somewhere down below. The whirlpool also caught up with the tugboat on the channel, which fought the current as long as it could before the crew had to jump onto the canal shore and watch as the lake swallowed their vessel. But things got even crazier. 3 hours later, the lake had turned into a huge, deep crater from which more than 3.4 billion gallons of water had flowed out. The ruptured gas pipeline in the center of the crater caught fire and sent a column of flames into the sky. The Federal Aviation Administration rerouted all flights over the area out of fear of a natural gas explosion. But that didn't happen. Instead, the tallest waterfall in Louisiana appeared. As you can imagine, so much water flowed into the lake and the caves, we'll talk about those a bit later, that the flow in the Cambrai Canal, which usually connects the lake and Vermilion Bay, changed direction. As a result, salt water from the Gulf of Mexico rushed into what used to be a freshwater lake. This reverse flow created the tallest waterfall in the state standing at a height of 164 feet for several days. Eyewitnesses compared the site to the eruption of Mount St. Helens, although to be honest, I don't really see the connection. But then again, I wasn't there. However, the insanity didn't stop there. The air, pushed out by the water flowing under the lake, burst through the shafts as compressed air, and then in the form of 400-foot geysers. Only after that did everything gradually calm down. So it used to be a freshwater lake about 10 feet deep, a popular spot to relax. And in the blink of an eye, it turned into a brackish lake with a maximum depth of 200 feet. Now it's the deepest lake in Louisiana. And here's what it looks like today. This chimney, once part of a house on the edge of an old lake, sticks out above the water all alone. But why did all this even happen? Actually, I bet you can already guess. So at least since 1919, commercial salt mining has been going on at Jefferson Island. By the 1930s, large-scale sulfur mining operations were underway, and this mineral also started bringing in profits for the landowners. But we're more interested in the salt. The mine where it was extracted had several levels, going as deep as 1,500 feet below the surface. Each tunnel was about 100 feet by 80 feet, and to support the ceiling, salt pillars were left in place at the levels. It was these pillars that were dissolved by the incoming fresh water, leading to the collapse of the mine's tunnels. Actually, this wouldn't have happened if it weren't for oil extraction. That's the reason it all started to go downhill. Texaco Oil applied for and won a government lease that included land beneath Lake Peigneur. And then they went too far. The mistake was that diamond crystal salt was also working under the lake, basically creating a huge bubble that Texaco Oil managed to pop. Incorrect measurements by Texaco Oil caused the drill bit to punch through the salt mine. This was an inactive third level of the salt mine. The hole created a sinkhole that drained the lake into the mine. In turn, it filled the huge caves that were left after the salt was removed. Could this have been avoided? Well, if the calculations had been correct, maybe. But the delay also played a part. Between the moment when the drill got stuck and the moment the rig started tilting, 2.5 hours passed. All that time, people scratched their heads and wondered why the drill wouldn't keep going, while the fresh lake water dissolved the salt and expanded the hole. And by then, stopping the process was impossible. The shafts had pretty much sucked the lake in. Now I guess it's time to talk about oil. The oil and gas industry has been the dominant economic driver in Louisiana for over a century. Today it generates about a quarter of the state's revenue and provides jobs for tens of thousands of people. Louisiana consistently ranks among the top states in the country for oil and gas production, as well as for its oil refining capacity. Salt domes are directly connected to fossil fuels. They're considered places that can be oil traps. That's what we call parts of natural reservoirs capable of holding hydrocarbon deposits. It's simple. Salt is impermeable to oil, so in oil geology, the formation of a salt dome often pushes the land up, while also creating an underground storage space. Salt domes are the main spots for drilling wells in search of oil and natural gas, so it's no surprise that both salt and oil were extracted from the same place. The problem is that different companies basically ran into each other in the same underground area. Fortunately, to be honest, it's an enormous stroke of luck there were no human casualties, though it was reported that 3 dogs died. All 55 employees who were in the mine at the time of the accident were saved, and 6 employees were later awarded by Diamond Crystal Salt for their heroism. The successful evacuation was made possible by the mine's electrician, who noticed the flow of water and raised the alarm. Discipline and employee training played a big role as they managed to escape using the only lift. They just did it in a very well-organized way. The crew of the drilling rig, all 7 of them, left the platform just before it plunged into the deeper parts of the lake. A fisherman who was on the lake at the time steered his small boat to shore and got to safety. A few days after the disaster, once the water pressure had equalized, 9 out of the 11 sunken barges shot out of the whirlpool and floated up to the surface of the lake. After that, Texaco Oil accused Diamond Crystal Salt of keeping their mining operations a secret, while Diamond Crystal Salt argued that Texaco Oil and its subcontractors made mistakes with the calculations when they were preparing to start drilling. Live Oak Foundation, which was involved in plant cultivation, sued both companies for damage since more than 64 acres of coastal property were swallowed up. In the end, the foundation was awarded $12 million in damage compensation to be paid in different amounts by all the responsible parties. Texaco Oil was ordered to pay Diamond Crystal Salt $45 million as the oil company was eventually found guilty. Despite the responsible parties being held accountable, the underground salt mining operations on Jefferson Island were actually shut down. Hundreds of workers lost their jobs and didn't receive a single cent after the settlement. At first, it was unclear who was at fault. The Mine Safety and Health Administration couldn't figure out who was to blame because they couldn't determine whether Texaco Oil had drilled the well in the wrong spot or if the mine maps were inaccurate. Evidence that could have confirmed the cause was washed away by the whirlpool. Later, of course, they figured it out, but that hardly comforted the people who lost their jobs. But what about the impact on the lake itself? The biology of the water body has drastically changed, and it's become home to many species of sea plants and fish that weren't there before. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any more information. It's like no one, except me, cares about the fate of the fish and other inhabitants of Lake Penior, so let me make some guesses. First of all, most freshwater fish species can't survive in salty water, which means they died. However, there are species that can adapt to changes in salinity. If there were any like that in the lake, they would have survived. Well, if they survived being sucked into the mine and then back out, because if the whirlpool managed to suck in a barge and a drilling rig, it's logical that it sucked up the fish too. Many of the lake's inhabitants probably died during the disaster from physical injuries, not to mention the effect of the salt dome. Oh, and don't forget that water used to flow from the lake to the Gulf of Mexico through a canal, and then the current changed. This might be how some sea creatures ended up in the lake. But in any case, the disaster almost certainly caused an upheaval among the underwater inhabitants. It probably even completely changed the population. If you have more accurate and detailed information on that, feel free to share it in the comments. What's going on with the lake today? Since 1994, AGL Resources has been using a salt dome as a storage and concentrator for compressed natural gas. You remember, right? Oil and gas can't seep through salt. It's a pretty interesting but overall quite common storage practice, especially considering that domes can easily be carved out using water to dissolve salt crystals, and then you can use them however you like. Sometimes even radioactive or toxic waste is stored underground in these former domes. But in this case, it's just natural gas, and they even want to expand the storage, much to the locals' dismay. 4,000 residents are concerned about saltwater intrusion into the Shika aquifer and safety issues for those living within a 1-mile radius of the lake. Look, right now 2 caves under the lake are being used. They want to drill a couple more also there. And it's no wonder this is causing alarm. To create another dome, AGL Resources has to drill a well deep below the surface and pump millions of gallons of water to dissolve the salt. Then this water's removed, leaving room for storing natural gas. The problem is that this fresh water for dissolution will be taken from the Shika aquifer, the main source of drinking water. After that, it'll become salty, making it undrinkable and unsuitable for other uses. In Del Cambre, hundreds of residents and 2 schools are within a 1.8-mile radius of the lake, so the concerns are understandable. The locals don't want to face another monstrous disaster if more caves are created, especially considering that Penior Lake isn't the only place in Louisiana where a catastrophe related to sinkholes and salt domes has happened. The deadliest disaster in the history of salt mines in South Louisiana claimed the lives of 21 miners 1,200 feet below sea level. It happened on March 5, 1968 in Belle Isle, St. Mary Parish. But I want to talk not about that, but about what happened in the little place called Bayou Corn, also in Louisiana, of course. People realized something was off months before the incident. Against the backdrop of reports about the strange bubbling in the bay, they could hear an odd rumbling beneath their houses. They'd never experienced anything like it. At first, reports of underground tremors were met with disbelief. The director of the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources, Department of Injection and Mining, even suggested that it might have been heavy trucks driving on the nearby Highway 70. Then, when a huge sinkhole suddenly appeared in the ground, one of the locals suggested calling the director, tell him his truck just landed in the bayou. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The bubbling discovered in the bay indicated a gas leak. Residents had repeatedly reported this to the authorities since the end of May 2012, but they never did anything about that. This went on until August 3rd, when residents woke up to a strong smell of diesel fuel. The smell was so intense that it caused headaches and nausea. The source soon became clear. a sinkhole that formed between Bayou Corn and Grand Bayou. Officials who flew over the area reported that trees had fallen across an area that was initially said to be about 200 by 200 feet. Estimates now say this area is about 370 feet in diameter and 420 feet deep. The pipeline that ran through that area shifted. It was quickly repaired, but the bubbling continued, indicating that it wasn't caused by gas at all. The abandoned wells weren't to blame either. People were basically living on top of the Napoleon Salt Dome. Bingo! Salt was mined there, and then the space was used for storing petroleum products. The company denied that there was anything wrong with the storage, but it soon became clear that the outer wall of the salt dome had collapsed. As a result, sediment got into the cavity, that is, the empty space in the rock, and oil and gas seeped to the surface, causing tremors and bubbles that the locals observed. People had to be urgently evacuated, as many as 350 people, and the evacuation order could last for many years. Just to give you an idea, the evacuation was declared back in 2012, and they said it could drag on for 5 years. But by 2018, the Homa Today newspaper reported that the area of the sinkhole, which originally covered 2.5 acres, had grown to almost 35 acres. And it seems like it's still growing. The biggest news from the past few days is that I finished watching the show Lost, where people got stranded on an island after a plane crash. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. It's an old show, but I guarantee many will like it. Dangerous domes. According to data from state authorities, at least 12 underground storage facilities in Louisiana are dangerously close to the edges of their load-bearing rock formations. On top of that, another 15 caverns in the danger zone might not meet safety standards. So you get the picture, right? We're not talking about 1 or 2 sites in the state, there are tons of them, and all of them pose a threat to people working in mining and extraction. While experts claim there's no sign of danger in any of these storage facilities, the authorities prefer to play it safe because of potential risks. Proposed measures include setting a minimum safety distance of 300 feet from the so-called edge of the salt dome and introducing long-term monitoring for specific caverns. Additionally, Louisiana authorities have demanded that operators of salt domes provide data on the location of 256 caverns in the state relative to the boundaries of the salt formations where they're located. I hope they'll keep a close eye on this because 27 caverns are currently too close to the set limit, making it dangerous to work there. 6 of them, located less than 100 feet from the edge of the salt dome, will be shut down and kept under observation. The owners of another 21 caverns located between 100 and 300 feet away will have to prove they can be operated safely within a year, even though many are no longer in use. A bacterium in the lake. New species are usually found in remote corners of the planet like tropical rainforests or the permafrost of Antarctica. But something curious was discovered at the bottom of Lake Peigneur. And yes, that something had been in hibernation for millions of years. Let's take it step by step. We've already found out that Lake Peigneur was hiding various minerals underground. Then, after the disaster, the environment changed dramatically. Originally, the water in the lake had less than 2% of salt, but then the salinity shot up to an incredible 32%. That's 9 times saltier than seawater, by the way. Naturally, because of this, water samples were taken, and to the scientists' surprise, a special species of bacteria was found. These organisms belong to a group that prefers salty environments, but for them, the optimal salt level is 18%. And here we've got 32%. Now, do you see why the scientists were so amazed? Essentially, bacteria shouldn't even be able to survive in such conditions, but they were still discovered in Lake Peigneur. And this brings us back to what I said at the very beginning of the story. The bacteria might have simply been in hibernation, meaning their life processes just stopped, waiting for better times. It's known that the salt under Lake Peigneur formed from the evaporation of an ancient salty body of water. Some of this salt dates back 125 million years when dinosaurs still roamed the earth. So researchers believe that the newly discovered species of microorganisms lived in the lake before the mine flooded, staying in droplets of water trapped inside salt crystals. Donating property. As you've probably figured out, the residents of the areas around Penure Lake aren't too thrilled about companies using the empty spaces and salt domes to store gas and oil. To ease tensions a bit, Jefferson Island Storage and Hub announced an agreement with the community group Save Penure Lake. Under this agreement, the company will donate 23 acres of land near the lake to create an environmental center. The land, covered with forest and owned by the company, had remained unused for a long time. Also, there weren't any plans to build anything there. It just stood there, doing nothing. And then the moment came when the abandoned land became useful. The local community will be able to make the best use of it, taking into account the needs and desires of the population. However, there are a couple of conditions: preserving the natural area and ensuring free access to it for everyone who wants to visit. In other words, these 23 acres will become a great place for ecotourism. A few years ago, it would have been hard to imagine such an agreement, considering the legal disputes and the opposition from the local community, but now the relationship with the gas storage company has changed drastically. And it's not just about the land that was handed over. The company has shown more responsibility when it comes to preventing leaks from the storage facilities, has started keeping residents better informed about the plant's operations, and is more willing to listen to their concerns. Another disaster. Just to show you how dangerous salt domes can be, let me tell you about another disaster related to them. In 2020, 2 miners died when the roof of the Avery Island salt mine collapsed, and yes, once again in Louisiana. There were 16 other workers in the mine, but according to the food giant Cargill, they managed to evacuate. What do we know about the causes of the collapse? Almost nothing. The site, located about 30 miles south of Lafayette, was closed for an investigation into the incident. However, the local newspaper, The Advocate, reported that according to the Mine Safety and Health Administration, federal inspectors issued more than 50 safety violation warnings at the mine in the past year. According to the same newspaper, an inspection at the Avery Island mine found several violations with the underground personnel rescue devices, and the inspectors issued warnings to the company for hazardous waste, unattended equipment, training issues, and emergency stop devices on conveyors. Well, it's clear now that the disaster couldn't be avoided. They just didn't keep an eye on the mine. You owe me an unobtrusive like, since you've made it this far. See you later.